In the heart of the medieval age, justice was not written in law books, but carved in flesh and bone. Villages were ruled by fear, not fairness, and a man's fate could change with a single accusation whispered. In the market square, there were no police, no cameras, no proof, only rumor, power, and pain. The church bell would toll once, deep and heavy, signaling that judgment was about to begin. People gathered in the square, their breath fogging in the cold morning air. Children stood on their toes, clutching their mother's skirts, waiting to see what justice looked like. The accused, a thin, trembling man with mud on his face, was dragged by 2 guards to the center. His crime, stealing bread from the Lord's granary. In today's world, it would be a petty crime, but in the medieval world, stealing from your Lord was a sin against the order of God himself, and sins were not forgiven, they were punished. The crowd began to murmur as the executioner arrived. He was dressed in black leather, his face hidden behind an iron mask, and in his hand, a whip made of braided ox hide. The man's eyes widened when he saw the stake in the ground. He knew what was coming, the flogging post. It was older than the church behind it, stained with years of blood and confession. The man begged for mercy, but mercy was a rare luxury in these lands. 2 guards tied his wrists to the wooden beam, pulling his back taut. Then the first lash came, a sharp crack that echoed through the square like thunder. The crowd flinched. The second lash tore through skin. The third brought blood. By the 10th, the man could no longer scream, only tremble, his body broken under the name of justice. The local priest stepped forward, holding a wooden cross. He spoke words of divine pardon, blessing the punishment as the will of God. In truth, it was power, disguised as holiness. Every blow reminded the peasants watching that order must never be questioned. That sin, no matter how small, would be met with pain. When the flogging ended, the man was left in the mud. The Lord's steward announced that his punishment was complete, but his shame would remain forever. His family would bear the mark of his crime. His children would never again be trusted. That was the true cruelty of medieval punishment. It did not end with the pain. It continued in whispers, in stares, in ruined reputations. As the sun dipped low, the villagers dispersed. The square emptied, but the blood on the post glistened like a warning. Tomorrow, perhaps, another soul would take his place. For in the medieval world, punishment was not just a sentence. It was a performance. A reminder to all that justice was not about fairness, it was about fear. The executioner cleaned his whip, silent and detached. He did not see himself as cruel. He saw himself as necessary. Without fear, he believed there would be chaos. And so, with each lash, he kept order in a world balanced on the edge of madness. The priest whispered a final prayer before leaving. The man on the ground did not move. Only the wind answered the prayer, cold and uncaring. The torches went out one by one. Darkness returned to the square, and the medieval night swallowed its secret once again. In the medieval world, when proof was scarce and truth was hidden beneath superstition, justice was left in the hands of God. It was believed that he alone could reveal the innocent and condemn the guilty. There were no judges as we know them, only priests and executioners, and between them stood the accused, trembling in fear. This was the age of the trial by ordeal, where suffering was considered sacred and pain was a language through which God spoke his will. To the villagers, this was not cruelty, it was divine order. To question it was to question heaven itself. In the year 1247, in a small English village shadowed by forests and fog, a woman named Elspeth was brought before the altar. She was a healer, a woman who used herbs and whispers of old knowledge to cure the sick. But when a Lord's child recovered after she laid hands upon him, the people began to talk. They said she had made a deal with the devil, that her herbs were cursed, her prayers blasphemous. In a world ruled by ignorance, wisdom was dangerous, and so Elspeth became a witch in the eyes of the people she once helped. The church decided she would face trial by boiling water. The logic was cruelly simple. She would plunge her arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone at the bottom. If her flesh came out unharmed, she would be declared innocent, protected by God's mercy. If she burned, she was guilty. The villagers gathered in the churchyard. The smell of smoke and fear thick in the air. The priest stood tall in his robe, his voice echoing through the stone walls. as he declared that Goddess would soon be revealed. The cauldron hissed like an angry serpent, steam curling into the cold air. Elspeth stood silent, her face pale but proud. The priest asked her to confess, but she said only one thing: "If I die, let God know I healed, not harmed." Then, with trembling hands, she reached into the boiling water. A scream tore through the silence, a sound so sharp that even the birds fled from the church roof. When she lifted her arm, the skin was blistered and peeling, red as blood. The priest looked upon her wounds and nodded slowly. "The Lord has judged," he said. The crowd murmured prayers, some with pity, others with satisfaction. Her fate was sealed by the very faith she once trusted. They locked her in a cold stone cell for 3 days to see if her wounds would heal. The church taught that if her arm began to mend, she might still be innocent. But her burns festered with infection, and the smell of decay filled the air. On the 3rd morning, they declared the devil had marked her. The villagers dragged her to the edge of town, where a great oak tree stood, the same tree where thieves and heretics had met their end. There, she was tied to a wooden post surrounded by straw. Her eyes lifted to the sky as the priest recited the final prayer. "May God have mercy on your soul," he said, and gave the signal. The torch was set to the straw. Flames leapt high, wrapping around her body, devouring cloth and flesh. Her screams became one with the crackling fire, rising toward the heavens that had abandoned her. The people watched, silent and trembling. To them, this was justice. To her, it was betrayal. When the flames died and the ashes cooled, her name was struck from the church records. No one spoke of her again, at least not aloud. But that night, the villagers swore they heard her voice in the wind, whispering through the trees that had watched her burn. Some said it was guilt. Others said it was a spirit, restless, searching for truth in a world that knew none. In the years that followed, more trials came. Some men were forced to walk barefoot across burning iron. Others were cast into rivers with stones tied to their waists. If they floated, they were guilty, for the water, symbol of purity, rejected evil. If they sank, they were innocent, but drowned. Either way, the church called it divine justice, and the people believed, because they were too afraid not to. The priests slept well, convinced they had served God's will. The villagers, however, lay awake, haunted by the screams they could still hear in their dreams. The trial by ordeal continued for centuries, fueled by ignorance and fear. It was a system built not on truth, but on terror, a ritual that turned pain into proof. Yet for all its cruelty, it revealed something deeper about the medieval mind, a desperate need to make sense of chaos, to find meaning in suffering. For them, every scream, every burn, every death was a message from heaven. And as the fires died down, the silence that followed was mistaken for peace. But beneath that silence, fear ruled, and it was fear, not faith, that kept their world from falling apart. Beneath the castles of kings and the cathedrals of faith, there lay a hidden world, a place untouched by sunlight, where justice echoed in screams and prayers mixed with blood. These were the torture chambers of the Inquisition, the dark heart of medieval punishment. Here, men of God claimed to save souls by destroying bodies. They believed that pain could reveal truth, that the voice of a tortured man was the voice of God's justice. But in truth, it was fear that spoke louder than faith. It began in the 12th century, when heresy spread like wildfire through Europe. The church feared new ideas, words that questioned its power, books that challenged its authority, voices that whispered of freedom. To silence them, the Inquisition was born. Inquisitors roamed from village to village, cloaked in black, carrying the authority of both crown and cross. To some, they were saviors of purity. To others, they were angels of death. Wherever they went, fear followed. In a dark dungeon beneath a monastery in southern France, a young scholar named Mathieu awaited his fate. His crime was curiosity, reading forbidden texts that dared to suggest that the earth moved around the sun, and that salvation did not belong solely to the church. For such thoughts, he was accused of heresy. He had denied it once, but denial meant defiance, and defiance meant torture. He sat chained to a wall slick with moisture, listening to the drip of water and the soft hum of the torturer sharpening his tools. The air smelled of rust, candle smoke, and despair. The Inquisitor entered, tall, pale, with eyes that saw no humanity, only sin. Behind him came the torturer, silent and hooded, carrying an assortment of instruments, iron pincers, ropes, wheels, and screws. The Inquisitor's voice was calm, almost tender. "My son," he said, "confession will save your soul." Matthew whispered that he was innocent, but innocence meant nothing here. The rack was prepared, the ropes tightened, and his limbs were stretched until joints cracked like dry wood. Screams filled the stone chamber. The Inquisitor watched, unmoved, murmuring prayers between questions. "Do you confess?" he asked again and again. Matthew's answers turned to cries, his strength to sobs. He confessed to anything they wished, not out of guilt but out of agony. He named names he didn't know, admitted to sins he'd never imagined. When he finally broke, the Inquisitor smiled faintly. "The truth has been revealed," he said, closing his book as if a sermon had ended. But truth bought through torment was no truth at all. The next morning, Matthew was dragged into the courtyard, his body broken and soul hollow. Villagers gathered as the executioner tied him to a stake. The Inquisitor offered one last prayer, claiming that this sacrifice would purify the land. Flames rose, licking the dawn sky. The scholars' cries echoed through the square before being swallowed by smoke. To the church, it was another victory for God. To history, it was another sin committed in his name. The Inquisition's reach spread like a shadow across Europe, from France to Spain, from Italy to the farthest corners of Christendom. The instruments of torture became symbols of order, the wheel that tore limbs apart, the strappado that dislocated shoulders, the thumbscrew that crushed fingers, the Iron Maiden that closed like a coffin of spikes. Each tool had its place in the hierarchy of pain. Each confession written in blood was treated as gospel. And yet, the torturers themselves were not always monsters. Some prayed after every session, asking forgiveness for the suffering they caused. Others convinced themselves they were healers of the soul, purging evil through agony. They called it salvation by pain, a cruel irony that turned mercy into torment. Even the Inquisitors believed they were serving divine will, not cruelty. The true horror of the Inquisition was not its sadism, but its sincerity. Above the dungeons, life continued untouched. Bells rang for morning prayers, merchants shouted in the streets. Children played in sunlight while, beneath their feet, the air was filled with screams. The church stood tall and holy above the blood-soaked stones, its walls echoing with hymns, and beneath those hymns, the cries of men and women who dared to think differently. The world above called it justice. The world below called it hell. Over time, the stones of those chambers absorbed centuries of agony. Even when the Inquisition waned, the walls seemed to remember. Visitors swore they could still hear chains rattling in the dark, faint whispers of prayers and apologies that never ended. History tried to bury it, but the truth remained carved into the earth, a reminder that the line between faith and fear was razor-thin. In the end, the Inquisition taught one terrible lesson: that power, when wrapped in holiness, becomes unstoppable. The torturers believed they were saving souls, yet they destroyed countless lives. And the people, too afraid to speak, watched in silence, convincing themselves it was the will of God. Such was the nature of medieval justice, blind, brutal, and blessed by those who ruled through faith. In the medieval world, truth was not always found through logic or law. It was sought through pain. When words failed and witnesses lied, people turned to what they called God's judgment. It was not the judgment of men, but of heaven itself, revealed through suffering. This system was known as the trial by ordeal, a terrifying ritual that decided guilt not by evidence, but by divine intervention. The accused would stand before a priest trembling. Surrounded by villagers and guards, a sacred prayer would be spoken, asking God to reveal the truth through the ordeal. To the people watching, it was holy justice. To the one standing in chains, it was a death sentence wrapped in faith. One of the most feared trials was the ordeal by fire. A red-hot iron was heated until it glowed like the gates of hell. The accused would be ordered to lift it with bare hands and walk 3 paces. Then, the iron would be placed back, and the priest would wrap the man's hands in linen. For 3 days, those hands would remain bound. On the 3rd day, the priest would unwrap them before the crowd. If the burns were clean and healing, the man was innocent. God had protected him. If they festered and bled, he was guilty and punishment awaited. Another ordeal was by water, both cold and boiling. In the boiling water test, the accused would reach into a cauldron of scalding liquid to retrieve a stone from the bottom. In the cold water version, he would be bound and thrown into a river. The belief was strange and cruel. If he floated, he was guilty because the pure water rejected him. If he sank, he was innocent, but often drowned before anyone could save him. Either way, few survived with life of faith intact. Women accused of witchcraft suffered most under these ordeals. Their trials were brutal, and their cries echoed across valleys and forests. The villagers believed they were servants of darkness, and so fire was often their final judge. It was said that if a woman survived the flames, she was a witch and would be killed anyway. If she burned, she was innocent and her soul was free. This twisted logic was the heart of medieval fear, a world where reason died under the weight of blind belief. The priests performed these trials with solemn faces, claiming they were instruments of God. But behind the rituals lay politics, power, and superstition. Lords used ordeals to control peasants, to silence rebels, and to rid themselves of threats without question. A single accusation could destroy a life, and once the ordeal began, no one dared to interfere. It was not about justice, it was about obedience. The crowd always watched in silence. Mothers clutched their children closer, men crossed themselves, and whispers spread like ghosts. To them, each ordeal was proof that God was watching, that sin would not go unpunished. Yet deep inside, even they feared that one day it might be them standing at the center, bound and trembling. When the ordeal ended, the priest would raise his hands to the heavens and declare the verdict. Sometimes the accused collapsed, burned and broken, only to be dragged away for further punishment. The people would disperse slowly, heads bowed, their faith shaken but their fear renewed. The church bells would toll, echoing over the fields, and life would continue until the next trial, the next soul, the next scream. As night fell, the smell of burned flesh and incense lingered in the air. The priest washed his hands in holy water, whispering prayers to cleanse his soul, though guilt remained heavy in his heart. He told himself it was God's will, but in truth, he knew it was men who made these rules. In the distance, wolves howled. The village returned to uneasy sleep, but somewhere in the dark, the next accused waited for dawn for their turn to prove innocence through agony. The trial by ordeal was not just punishment, it was a reminder to all who watched. In the medieval world, truth belonged to the strong, and justice was written in blood. Far beneath the stone castles of medieval Europe, where sunlight never reached and prayers could not echo, there existed a world of silence and fear. These were the torture chambers, cold rooms built to serve the word of kings and inquisitors. Their walls were thick, their doors heavy, and their purpose clear, to make people speak what rulers wanted to hear. The people of that time believed that truth could be drawn out through suffering, that fear could reveal honesty, and that confession meant justice. It was a belief that blurred the line between faith and cruelty. When the condemned were led below, their footsteps echoed down winding staircases carved into rock. The air grew colder with every step, filled with the smell of smoke and old metal. Torches flickered, casting long shadows that moved like restless spirits inside. Everything was prepared, chains, ropes, and tables of iron tools polished to reflect the firelight. The chamber was not loud or chaotic. It was eerily calm, quiet as a church, but heavy with unspoken dread. The men who worked there were not monsters. They were servants of the crown, executioners, guards, or inquisitors sworn to carry out orders. Many of them feared their duties, but obeyed because refusal meant joining those they punished. They performed their tasks with mechanical precision, following rituals that had been passed down for generations. Some prayed before they began, others whispered apologies no one could hear. The accused were questioned under the glow of torchlight, surrounded by men who sought confession rather than truth. Some confessed quickly, afraid of what might come next. Others stayed silent, believing that innocence would protect them. But in that time, innocence was not enough. Words alone could not save a person once they were brought beneath a castle. The walls of those chambers witnessed the collapse of courage, the breaking of loyalty, and the misuse of faith. People accused of witchcraft, rebellion, or blasphemy were forced to answer for crimes they never understood. Each word spoken down there carried the weight of life and death. Outside, the townspeople only saw justice being served. They never saw the silence that followed. At night, when the torches were put out, the chamber would fall completely still. Only the faint drip of water from the ceiling broke the quiet. Some said the walls held memories, that they remembered every voice, every prayer, every whisper for mercy. The executioners claimed they could hear those echoes when they were alone, as if the stone itself mourned what had been done within it. Despite its horror, the torture chamber represented a system that believed in divine order. The church and the crown saw it as a way to purify the soul and protect the world from evil. They believed they were defending truth, not realizing that in doing so, they had buried it. For every confession gained, countless lies were born. For every punishment delivered, faith in justice weakened. As centuries passed, people began to question such cruelty. Scholars, monks, and even kings slowly recognized that pain could not reveal truth. The world began to change, slowly replacing fear with reason. The chambers were locked, abandoned, and forgotten, left to rot beneath the castles that once relied on them. Today, only ruins remain, silent, corridors and rusted chains that remind us how far people can go when fear becomes law. The lesson left behind is clear. When power is unchecked and mercy is lost, justice turns to darkness. The torture chambers of the medieval age were not only rooms of pain, they were mirrors of human weakness, proof that even in the name of faith and order, cruelty can hide beneath the mask of righteousness. And so, those halls of stone remain empty now, echoing only with the wind, as if whispering their final warning to the world above, never let fear become justice again. In the medieval world, justice was not hidden behind stone walls. It was displayed before the eyes of the people. Public executions were not only punishments but performances, great spectacles meant to teach obedience through fear. At dawn, the townsfolk gathered in the square, their breath rising in the cold air, drawn by curiosity, fear, and something darker, fascination. Bells rang slowly from the church tower, summoning everyone to witness what they called the king's justice. For the rulers, these moments were necessary. They believed that to keep peace, they had to remind the people who held power over life and death. The platforms were built days before, wooden stages raised high so every citizen could see. Guards stood in rows, priests murmured prayers, and the executioner prepared his tools with careful precision. There was order, ceremony, and silence before the event began. When the condemned were brought forth, their faces often pale and resigned, the crowd would murmur in anticipation. Some shouted curses, others crossed themselves or whispered blessings. Children clutched their mother's skirts, both frightened and unable to look away. The condemned might confess, offer forgiveness, or proclaim innocence. But the crowd did not come for truth. They came for closure, for the reassurance that justice still ruled their world. To them, these executions were both punishment and warning. The lesson was simple. Defy the crown or the church, and the same fate awaited you. The event was choreographed with precision. The priest offered last rites, the herald read the charges, and the executioner performed his role as both judge and actor. The crowd gasped, whispered, and then applauded the sentence's completion as though watching the final act of a grim play. For some, it was justice served; for others, a moment of dread. Merchants sold food near the square, and children played after it was over, a chilling reminder of how normal such scenes had become. Fear had become a form of entertainment. To the rulers, this was power displayed. Each execution reinforced authority, showing that rebellion, theft, or blasphemy had only one end. The townspeople went home in silence afterward, their minds filled with the echo of the priest's final prayer. Yet even as they slept, that image, the stage, the crowd, the silence that followed, stayed in their dreams. The power of fear lasted far longer than the punishment itself. Not all found comfort in such displays. Some monks and philosophers began to question the practice, wondering whether justice truly required death to prove its strength. If punishment teaches obedience, one scholar wrote, then mercy teaches wisdom. But few dared to speak aloud against the system. The church's voice was law and the king's will was divine. Dissent was a dangerous luxury. Over time, the stage of execution became more than just a platform of death. It became a symbol of order. People grew accustomed to it, and rulers depended on it. Yet even in those days, there were whispers among the people. Quiet doubts carried in taverns and churches. Does fear truly keep peace? They asked, or does it merely silence truth as centuries passed? The world changed. Justice slowly moved from public squares to courts and councils. The stage that once drew thousands fell silent. The tools of punishment were locked away, and the executioner's mask gathered dust. But the memory of those days did not fade. The empty squares, the ringing bells, and the silence after each verdict became part of history's shadow, a reminder of the price paid for order. Today, when we walk through old medieval towns, those open squares still hold echoes of the past. The cobblestones remember the footsteps, the towers remember the bells, and the wind seems to whisper the same warning that when justice becomes spectacle, humanity turns into an audience. The theatre of death may have ended long ago, but its lessons remain eternal. Fear can rule for a time, but mercy outlives it. In the vast theatre of medieval justice, there existed figures both feared and forgotten, the executioners. They were neither noble knights nor wicked villains, but men who lived on the border between law and damnation. Their faces were hidden behind masks, not for show, but for protection. To the people, they were cursed. To the rulers, they were necessary. The executioner's task was one that no one wished to speak of, yet everyone depended upon. His presence completed the ritual of justice. Without him, the system would collapse into hesitation. He was the invisible hand that turned judgment into reality. They were often outcasts, sons of debtors, criminals themselves, or men with no other trade. Some inherited the role from fathers who had borne the same burden, passing down both the craft and the curse. The village might pay them with coin or with silence, but never with respect. They lived at the edge of towns, near the forests or rivers, away from common folk. Few dared to share a meal with them. Children were warned not to speak their names, and priests sometimes refused them blessings. Yet when the time came, every eye turned to them, waiting for their grim duty to be done. An executioner's life was built on contradiction. By law, he was an agent of justice. By belief, he was a soul marked by sin. He stood between the condemned and the crowd, a man who carried the weight of divine order on one shoulder and human guilt on the other. Many records tell of executioners who prayed more than priests, not for mercy, but for forgiveness. They knew their hands were not evil, yet they could not escape the whispers that followed them. When they walked through markets, people stepped aside. When they entered taverns, silence followed. Even the innkeeper's smile turned cautious, as if fear itself had entered the room. In some towns, executioners were required to wear special clothing, a mark of office that also served as a warning. They were given certain privileges, free lodging, tax exemption, sometimes even land. But these rewards were hollow, for what good was wealth without peace? The executioner's family carried the same burden. His children found few willing to marry them, and his wife often lived in quiet sorrow, aware that her husband's hands, though clean, could never be truly pure in the eyes of others. Many of these men tried to find meaning in their work. Some convinced themselves they served a higher cause, the law, the king, or even God's will. Others found solace in craftsmanship, turning their tools into instruments of precision and honor. To them, justice demanded discipline. They maintained their equipment carefully, cleaned their workspace, and prepared mentally for each task. They knew that hesitation could mean chaos, and chaos was the one thing they were sworn to prevent. Despite their isolation, a strange kind of dignity surrounded them. They were the final link in a chain of authority, a living symbol of the crown's reach. The very people who cursed them also depended on them to keep order. When crime rose, towns sought them. When order returned, they were dismissed back into the shadows. No one wanted to know them, but everyone needed them. Such was the paradox of their existence, despised yet indispensable. There are tales of executioners who wept after their duties were done, washing their hands in rivers until the water ran clear. Others wrote letters begging the church for absolution. Some could not bear the silence that followed the act. for it was in silence that guilt found its loudest voice. Yet history also speaks of those who found peace through faith, convincing themselves that their burden was chosen by destiny, that someone had to do what others could not. On rare occasions, towns tried to honor their executioners in secret. A few were buried within church grounds, though without inscriptions. Others received blessings from priests who understood that their suffering was a kind of penance, but that most were forgotten. When they died, their homes were burned, their names erased, their tools buried deep. The world preferred to forget those who reminded it of its own cruelty. Still, not all executioners were broken. Some took pride in their position, embracing the fear they inspired. They learned to live within the shadow, using it as protection. To these men, fear was not a curse, it was armor. They believed they were chosen by fate to do what others lacked the courage to face. They carried themselves with a grim authority, walking through the streets with heads high, reminding everyone that justice demanded a price. Their strength kept kingdoms stable, their resolve made order possible. As centuries turned, their image changed. The executioner's mask became a symbol not of a man, but of an era. It represented the dark side of justice, the moment when mercy and law parted ways. When the Enlightenment began to reshape Europe, many of these men vanished. Their tools were melted down, their posts dissolved, their memory turned into myth. But the questions they embodied never disappeared. What is justice without compassion? What is duty without choice? In today's museums, we find their masks behind glass, their tools displayed as relics of a forgotten age. People look at them with curiosity, rarely realizing that each item once belonged to a man who bore the unbearable. So, others wouldn't he have to? Behind every mask was a face, behind every hand a conscience, and behind every act a struggle between fear and faith. The executioners of the medieval world were more than their trade. They were mirrors of their society, reflecting the darkness people refused to see in themselves. They lived not for glory, not for fame, but for survival, to serve a world that both used and shunned them. Their legacy remains a quiet lesson carved in history. As stone walls, justice without mercy becomes tyranny, and those who enforce it bear the deepest wounds. The executioner was not merely a man of punishment, he was the keeper of order, the servant of fear, and the silent reminder that in every age, someone must carry the weight of the world's judgment. Beneath the towering castles of kings and lords, hidden from the light of day, the medieval dungeons waited like open mouths hungry for the broken and the damned. The air was thick, choked with the scent of rusted iron, mold, and despair that clung to every breath. Prisoners were dragged down narrow stone corridors, the echo of their chains ringing louder than their cries. Each cell was no larger than a grave, built not for living but for forgetting. In those depths, time ceased to exist. The damp walls wept moisture, dripping like the steady ticking of some cruel clock, counting down the remains of a man's will. Guards rarely spoke. They did not need to. The sound of their boots alone was a language of fear. Some prisoners were thrown there for crimes of treason or murder, others for debts or blasphemy, yet once the heavy doors sealed behind them, all became equal beneath the weight of darkness. The only light came from torches that flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows that danced like spectres over hollow faces. Food was a punishment, not sustenance, a handful of mouldy bread or a cup of stale water, enough to keep them alive just to suffer another day. Rats scurried freely, bold in their rule, feasting on scraps and, sometimes, the flesh of the dead. Above, the world continued, festivals, markets, prayers, all pretending the dungeons did not exist. But the rulers knew. Every stone of the palace rested on the silence below, and that silence was bought with agony. When interrogations came, the prisoners were dragged to chambers lined with ropes, wheels and pulleys. The screams rose up the stairwells, muffled by the thick walls, swallowed by the wind outside. Yet in the candlelight, not every guard was without heart. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others whispered apologies before tightening the ropes. To survive there was not merely to endure, but to surrender, to let the soul detach itself from the body like a ghost leaving a corpse. Days bled into nights until faces blurred and names were forgotten. Hope became the cruelest torment of all, because hope reminded them of a world that would never come again. The dungeon keeper, A man whose eyes were dull from years in the dark once said that every prisoner taught him the same lesson, that cruelty does not need fire or steel, only time and silence. And so the dungeon remained a monument not to justice but to fear, echoing with the memory of those who were swallowed by its stone throat and never returned. In the heart of medieval cities, where cobbled streets wound like veins through markets and cathedrals, the place of judgment stood, a cold courtyard surrounded by stone pillars and banners of law. It was here that justice wore a mask, and mercy was a stranger. Trials in those times were not born of truth but of spectacle. The accused, often shackled and starving, were dragged before the crowd as the town crier shouted their crimes. Faces watched from every window, eager for entertainment disguised as righteousness. The judges, cloaked in robes heavy with symbols of faith, were less men of wisdom and more instruments of power, their words echoing the will of kings and priests. Sometimes the verdict was decided before the trial began. Gold spoke louder than honesty, and loyalty was often measured by fear. The accused had few tools of defense. In some courts, ordeals replaced reason. Iron, water, or fire would decide the will of God. A man might be forced to grasp a heated bar, his innocence determined by how long the flesh took to burn. Another would be bound and thrown into a river. If he floated, he was guilty, for water rejected evil. If he sank, he was innocent, but dead all the same. Women accused of witchcraft suffered the worst. Their screams were met with hymns, their tears with laughter, as the mob watched what they called divine judgment unfold. Priests blessed the torture, believing pain purified the soul, and executioners became servants of holy justice. There were trials of combat, too, where strength decided truth. Two men would enter the arena with swords, clubs, or even bare hands, fighting until blood and breath gave out. The winner's cause was declared righteous, and the loser's soul was cast to damnation. Yet not all who fought believed in what they defended. Many swung their blades only to survive another day in a world where justice was blind but not deaf to power. And when night fell, after the crowd dispersed and the banners drooped in the silence, the square was washed clean, not out of respect, but to erase the memory of what justice had become. In the flickering torchlight, one could almost see the shadows of those condemned still standing before the bench, their eyes hollow but unbroken, whispering to the wind that truth in those days was the first to be executed. The dawn broke red over the kingdom, staining the cobblestones like the memory of countless punishments that had taken place upon them. For centuries, fear had ruled in the name of law, and men had bowed not to truth but to terror. Yet as the bells tolled that morning, something had changed in the hearts of the people. The old ways were crumbling. Whispers spread through taverns and markets, whispers of mercy, of reform, of men daring to question the divine cruelty that had governed their lives. The kings had long promised order, but what the world had known instead was silence enforced by the sword. In the courtyards once, filled with cries of the condemned, children now played among weeds and cracked stones. The gallows creaked in the wind, unused, its rope frayed by time rather than flesh. The dungeons that had once swallowed the innocent stood empty, haunted not by ghosts but by regret. Those who had served as executioners, judges, and guards walked through their own memories like mourners at a funeral, unable to wash the stains of obedience from their souls. The change did not come suddenly, it came slowly, like dawn creeping through a narrow window. Scholars began to speak of law guided by reason rather than vengeance. Priests began to question whether God truly demanded blood for forgiveness. The people, once silent, found their voices and with them courage. Trials shifted from spectacle to debate. Juries replaced torches. Words replaced whips. But even as progress took its first steps, shadows lingered. The memory of iron and fire could not be forgotten easily. In the darkest corners of the kingdom, some still clung to the old belief that punishment must always hurt to be righteous. These were men who feared mercy more than cruelty, for mercy forced them to see the human face of those they once condemned. As decades passed, the architecture of power itself began to shift. The dungeons were sealed, the racks dismantled, and the execution squares turned into gardens or marketplaces. Where once stood gallows, now stood fountains, their waters murmuring peace where screams once echoed. Yet the earth beneath those stones still remembered. Every drop of blood spilled in the name of justice had soaked into the soil, whispering its story to those who listened closely enough. Justice, reborn, carried that memory like a scar, a reminder that righteousness without compassion becomes tyranny. The final executioner, an old man with trembling hands, laid down his blade beside the gallows and walked away without a word. No one stopped him. No one cheered. But in that silence lay a truth deeper than any verdict, that the age of fear was ending, and with it, the beginning of humanity's long and painful understanding that the truest justice is mercy. Centuries passed, and the age of iron and torment faded into legend. The castles still stood, proud and silent against the horizon, their stones holding the memory of screams long gone. The gallows had rotted away, the dungeons sealed beneath moss and time, yet the air round them carried a weight, a whisper of the thousands who had once begged the heavens for mercy that never came. Historians now walked where prisoners once crawled, their lanterns tracing the carvings on cell walls, marks of names, prayers, and desperate farewells. In libraries and courts, men spoke proudly of progress, of how civilization had conquered cruelty, but the ghosts of justices past still lingered, unseen yet unforgotten. Every reform, every law passed in the name of fairness, was born from the blood of those who had been broken beneath the old system. The executioner's blade had rusted, but its reflection lived on in the eyes of those who judged too quickly, condemned too easily, or turned away from suffering when it did not touch them directly. In the villages, mothers still told stories by candlelight of the dark days when men were punished not for guilt, but for being powerless. The children listened wide-eyed, safe yet uneasy, sensing that cruelty was not a thing of the past, but a shadow that could always return. In museums, relics of judgment were displayed, shackles, branding irons, the iron masks of shame, polished now, labeled with neat descriptions as if pain could be catalogued. Visitors stared in silence, some with horror, some with fascination, but none could truly feel the weight those tools once carried. And yet, beneath the glass, each object seemed to hum softly with memory, reminding the living that progress is fragile, that justice without compassion can once again become the machinery of fear. As the sun set over the ruins of the old court, a single bell rang from the church tower. Its sound drifted across the empty square where once the condemned had stood. The wind stirred through the grass that grew between the cobblestones, carrying with it the faintest echo not of pain, but of peace. The world had changed, yet it remembered. Justice had evolved, but only because it had first learned to weep. The gallows, the wheel, the dungeon, all were gone, but their lessons endured. That mercy is stronger than fear, that no kingdom built on suffering can last, and that even in the darkest ages, humanity's soul was never fully lost. For as long as those echoes remain, the world will remember what it cost to learn the meaning of justice.